The war had been going for 11 years before anyone thought to send a journalist. His name was Callum Reyes, and he was the kind of man who made generals uncomfortable, not because he was brave, which he was, but because he wrote things down. He had spent a decade embedding with frontline infantry battalions, with orbital defense platforms, with the hollow-eyed crews of hospital ships running 14-hour surgery rotations, while the debris fields outside their portholes grew thick as snowfall. He had filed dispatches from Kepler Station when the Vethcon siege guns had peeled its hull like a fruit rind. He had sent 1,700 words from Proxima Base before the uplink tower was destroyed. He had survived things that had no business being survivable, and he had written about all of it with the patience of a man building furniture, measuring twice, cutting once, never letting the grain of a sentence run the wrong way. His editor, a small, exhausted woman named Patricia Cho, had called him into her office at the Colonial Press Bureau and slid a classified intelligence brief across the desk without preamble. "The Moonfang," she said. Callum picked up the brief. He had heard the name. Every soldier in the outer systems had heard the name. The Moonfang Orc clans occupied a stretch of contested space in the Reach that nobody had ever properly mapped because the mapping drones came back with their sensor arrays removed, their cameras replaced with wildflowers woven from some material the xenobotanists were still arguing over. The Moonfang did not destroy what entered their territory. They edited it. They sent it back different. "They've opened a corridor," Patricia said. "One, the width of a single transport lane. They're permitting a delegation." "A peace delegation?" "No, that's what's strange." She folded her hands on the desk. She had a habit of doing that when she was unsettled. "They asked for us specifically, the press. They sent a request to the Colonial Press Bureau by name, through 11 relay stations, written in perfect standard with a vocabulary profile that suggested whoever composed it had been reading our dispatches for years." "That is strange." "The military is furious. They want to send a strike team through the corridor instead. The High Command is calling it a trap." She looked at him levelly. "I think it's the most important story in 11 years of war, and I want you in that corridor." He studied the brief for a long moment. The corridor was real. The invitation was real. And somewhere at the end of it was a people that humanity had been firing at for more than a decade without once stopping to ask who they were firing at. "Who else is going?" "You." A diplomatic liaison named Serafina Voss, who has precisely 0 experience with orc clans, and whoever the Moonfang send to meet you. Callum set the brief down. "When do I leave?" The transport was a small civilian shuttle, a deliberate choice, as the Moonfang's invitation had specified no warships. He and Serafina Voss spent the 6-hour transit comparing notes. She was young and competent and visibly terrified in the way that people are terrified when they understand exactly what they've volunteered for. She had read every xenological file on the Moonfang that existed, which amounted to approximately 40 pages of field observations, 80 pages of speculation, and a footnote bibliography of first-hand accounts from soldiers who had encountered them at close range and lived. A list considerably shorter than the list of soldiers who had not. "The tusk scarification," she said, scrolling through her tablet. "It's ritual. The number and placement denote lineage, rank, battle history. They can read an entire biography off a warrior's face." "What do ours say to them?" Callum asked. She thought about it. "Nothing, we're blank, we probably look unfinished." The corridor took them into a region of space that didn't appear on any navigation chart currently in use. The stars shifted in gradation, closer together, denser, a region of high stellar mass that played tricks on their navigation AI and made the hull sing at frequencies below human hearing, but not below human feeling. Callum sat with his notebook open on his knee, writing nothing yet, just letting the sounds of the ship settle into his body. They were met at the transition point by a single vessel. It was unlike anything in the military's recognition database. It wasn't built so much as it was shaped, curved and dark, and covered in an exterior material that caught starlight and redistributed it as something between reflection and absorption, so that the ship appeared to breathe. Standing in the docking bay as their shuttle locked into a magnetic cradle, and the seal hissed and pressurized around them, Callum felt the specific quality of silence that precedes something unrepeatable. The hatch opened. She walked through it like she owned the physics of the room. She was tall by any standard, taller than the standard orc warrior profiles in the military files, which described an average height of 2 meters and left it there, as if that single measurement was the most useful thing to know about a species that had survived in contested space for 3,000 years. Her skin was the deep gray-green of deep ocean water in winter, banded with the golden undertone that the files had mentioned and that photographs had never done justice to. The tusks were shorter than the males she commanded. She had 3 commanders with her, broad and silent as basalt columns, and carved with a density of scarification that even Callum, who knew nothing about how to read them, could see was extraordinary. Her name, delivered in a voice that carried without effort, was Vera. Vera of the Moonfang, daughter of the High Shard, heir to the concordance of 12 clans. "You are the journalist," she said. Her standard was unaccented and precise in the way of someone who had learned a language from text rather than speech, and then refined it over years until it settled into something entirely her own. "I am," Callum said. Her eyes amber, with the vertical pupils the files had mentioned, which photographs also had never done justice to, moved to his notebook. Not his weapon, not his recording equipment, his notebook. "I read your dispatch from Kepler Station," she said. "You wrote, 'The station did not fall. It was peeled open like something that was supposed to be hollow inside and wasn't.' I found that accurate." Callum looked at her steadily. "You were there." "My people have been at every engagement of the last 11 years, she said. "We have also read every word the Colonial Press Bureau has published about us. We have found approximately 11 sentences that were correct. The rest was imagination. That's why you invited a journalist." "That," she said, "and other reasons." She turned, gesturing them forward. "Come, there is much to show you and the window is narrow." The ship was not what the military files had led him to expect. The military files described Moonfang vessels as functional, stripped of anything non-essential, built for siege and endurance. This ship breathed. The walls of the corridors were lined with something that was not quite plant and not quite mineral, a low bioluminescent growth that the Moonfang moved past without looking at it, but also without ever quite ignoring it, the way people move through familiar and beloved rooms. There were sounds within the walls, low rhythmic sounds that he came to understand over the first hour were not mechanical but biological. The ship itself, living, processing, breathing around them. Vera gave them quarters that were spare but not uncomfortable. She gave them 48 hours. The first day, she showed him the war from her side. She did it methodically, in a conference chamber lined with star maps that were nothing like the Colonial Navy's charts. Denser, more particular, organized around principles of stellar gravity and resource flow rather than political demarcation. She walked him through 11 years of engagement records with the patience of a professor and the controlled anger of someone who has been patient for a very long time. "Proxima Base," she said, touching a point on the map. "You filed from there. You described the Vethcon as relentless. You described the human defenders as stubborn." "I used the word tenacious," he said. "Yes. You did not mention that the Vethcon were operating under a treaty obligation they did not want, enforced by a third party whose name your readers would not recognize because your press has never reported their existence." She looked at him. "The Meridian Compact. They are older than both our species. They have been using human-Moonfang conflict as a resource extraction mechanism for 9 years. They convinced the Vethcon that the Moonfang had allied with humanity. They convinced the human high command that the Moonfang were Vethcon aligned. They benefit from continued war because in war, all parties purchase weapons and navigation intelligence from neutral brokers. A pause. The compact are the neutral brokers. Callum wrote steadily. His hand did not stop moving. You have documentation. I have 11 years of documentation. I have been waiting for someone to bring it to. He did not write immediately after that. He looked at her instead, the way she stood, the way she held the star map's laser pointer as though she had been holding this specific briefing in her head for years, drilling it against a private audience of herself, perfecting it until she could deliver it without flinching. He had interviewed generals. He had interviewed survivors. He had interviewed people so far past their breaking point that what came out the other side had stopped being breakable. This was something different, a quality of controlled restraint that he had learned over 11 years to recognize as one of the most expensive things a person could maintain. How long have you been building this? He asked. The archive. 9 years. The understanding. A pause. Longer. I was 17 when the war began. My father's commanders said it would be over in a season. The Moonfang are not a species that has historically lost conflicts. Her mouth moved in the direction of something that was not a smile. We are also not a species that has historically been manipulated into fighting the wrong war. That particular combination, confidence in our strength, ignorance of the mechanism directing it, has been expensive. How many? He asked. Not how many battles, how many dead, she would understand. She understood. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. 31,408, she said. Confirmed. Our methodology for confirmation is rigorous. We do not count missing as dead. We count them separately. A pause. The missing number is smaller. We know where most of our people fall. The training sequences mean we can reconstruct engagements with precision. She touched the map at a different point. This is the site of the Battle of the Vareth Narrows. Year 3. 1,400 of our people died in 40 minutes because a compact intelligence broker fed both sides targeting data that guaranteed maximum casualties on both flanks simultaneously. She looked at him directly. Your people lost 900 at Vareth Narrows. You have a memorial. I know it, he said. He had been there. He had filed from it. We also have a memorial, she said. But we also have the intelligence brokers routing records, which we acquired 2 years later at considerable cost to 3 of our operatives who are not alive now. Those records are in the documentation archive. He wrote. He wrote, and she talked, and the star maps shifted around them as she moved from point to point with the careful economy of someone who has assigned each fact its proper weight and is delivering them in the order that will produce the clearest understanding. She was not performing. She was not trying to make him feel anything. She was giving him the material and trusting him, with a specificity that he found both bracing and humbling, to do his job. At the end of the 3rd hour, when she paused, he said, "Why a journalist? Why not approach the diplomatic corps directly?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he would not understand until much later in the 48 hours. Because diplomats carry the positions of governments, she said. Journalists carry the positions of truth. And in this particular situation, the governments of both our species have reasons to not want this truth known. He looked up from his notebook. Your government too. My father believed this war was with humanity, she said, and the words were precise and quiet as a surgical cut. He spent his life believing it. The clans whose sons and daughters died in 11 years of battle believe it. The truth I am about to share with you will not be welcomed by everyone among my people. I am the heir to the High Shard. That gives me the authority to make decisions my father would not have made. A pause, very small. It does not make it easy to make them. He looked at her steadily. Your father. He died in year 9, she said. At the siege of Veth Prime. He died believing he was defending our territory from human expansion. She picked up the laser pointer again and touched the map at the Veth Prime notation, and her hand was entirely steady. He was, in fact, defending our territory from human expansion. What he did not know was that the human fleet at Veth Prime had been told by compact intelligence brokers that the Moonfang clan base in that sector was a Vethcon weapons manufacturing hub. The fleet was not attacking the Moonfang. They believed they were dismantling a Vethcon supply chain. The room was very quiet. Both sides, Callum said slowly, were fighting the wrong war. For 11 years, she said, yes. He wrote that down. Then he wrote it again in different words, testing how it would sit on a page, whether there was a way to frame it that would make a reader who had spent 11 years thinking of the Moonfang as aggressors suddenly see the shape of what had actually happened. He was not sure yet. He needed more. He always needed more before the shape became clear. Your father, he said, did he know you were building the archive? He knew I was doing research, she said. He thought I was writing a military history. He was not wrong about what I was writing. He was not aware of what I planned to do with it. She looked at the map. He would have told me I was risking the clan's position in a diplomatic moment when we needed to show strength, not vulnerability. He would have been right about the risk. He would have been wrong about the calculus. She set the pointer down. My people have a saying, the warrior who refuses to examine the wound will die of it. My father was the greatest warrior I have known. He refused this particular examination. I believe it is what killed him, not the siege guns at Veth Prime. The certainty. He wrote that down too. And he wrote, in the margin where it was not meant to be read, she loved him. She loved him, and she is doing this anyway. That is what 11 years of carrying the truth does to a person. He did not show her the margin. Journalists rarely did. The second day was different. The second day, she took him to the training grounds. The ship was larger than it appeared from outside. A quality of Moonfang engineering he would later learn was deliberate. The outer hull calibrated to undersell the vessel's true dimensions, a survival adaptation. The training grounds occupied a chamber in the lower structure that must have been 300 meters across, its ceiling high enough that the top was lost in a simulated sky. The Moonfang home sky, he understood, the specific stars of the Concordance home system, rendered with a precision that made him feel their gravity. What happened in that space was not what the military files had called it. The military files called it combat training. The briefing's officers had used words like ritualized aggression and pack behavior and dominance display. The xenological files had at least had the grace to admit uncertainty, describing it as a physical practice of unknown cultural significance. What Callum saw was a language. 40 warriors moved in patterns that were too precise to be improvised and too fluid to be choreographed. They moved with and against each other in sequences that carried meaning. He could not read the meaning yet, but meaning was unmistakably there in the way that music carries meaning before you know the words. The patterns changed. A warrior would strike, and a ripple would move through the group's formation, and something would shift in their collective bearing, and the rhythm of the whole would bend around the new information the way water bends around a stone. There were sounds, low percussion, breath synchronized, that were coming from the warriors themselves, not from any instrument, a vocal accompaniment that emerged from the physical practice as naturally as breathing. Vera stood beside him and watched her people move. "What is it?" he asked. "There is not a word in standard," she said. "The closest is memory, but that doesn't capture it. It is the practice of remembering together. Each sequence records a historical truth, a battle, a treaty, a catastrophe, a survival. The body that learns these sequences carries the knowledge even when the mind does not have words for it." She paused. "We have been practicing the sequence for the Battle of Kepler Station for 2 years. The pattern for it is very complex. It took longer to learn than the battle itself took to fight." Callum watched a pair of warriors, one much older, one very young, move through a sequence that was all falling and catching, over and over, with a quality of absolute mutual trust. "What does that one say?" It says, "No one falls alone." He found himself watching the older warrior specifically. A woman, he thought, though the Moonfang gender markers he had been given in the xenological files proved immediately inadequate when confronted with actual Moonfang, and he had already stopped trying to apply them. She was perhaps 60, in human terms. She moved through the catching sequence with a quality of unhurried certainty. She had done this thousands of times. Her body knew every handwidth of the sequence, and yet she performed it for the young warrior beside her as if it were the first time, as if the young warrior's learning it for the first time was making it new again in her body too. There was a transmission happening, not just of technique, of something underneath technique, something about what it meant to trust another person with your full weight at the moment of falling. He thought about a dispatch he had filed from Kepler Station. He had described the final defensive unit, 17 soldiers, rotating in pairs, each pair catching the one that broke so the line never fully went. He had used the word formation because he hadn't known what else to call it. It was the same thing. Different skin, same bone. 17 humans and 40 Moonfang warriors, and whatever unnamed thing it was that made a species decide that falling together was better than standing alone. "The Battle of Kepler Station sequence," he said. "The one you've been practicing for 2 years. Can I?" He stopped. He wasn't sure how to ask. Vera looked at him. "It is not a spectator practice," she said. "The sequences are meant to be learned, not observed." A pause. "However, there is a smaller sequence that can be shown to someone outside the tradition. It is the opening movement, the acknowledgement of the other. We begin every session with it." "Could you show me?" he asked. "For the piece, I want to be able to describe it accurately." She looked at him for a moment in which he became aware that he had asked something that landed differently than he had intended, and that the difference was interesting to her. "Yes," she said. She crossed to the edge of the practice space, removed something from a hanging near the door, a wrap of the same dark material that lined the walls, meant to free the arms, and she stood across from him in the space and said, "Watch the feet first, then the hands, then neither." She was exactly what the files had failed to capture, which was that she moved the way she talked, with economy and precision, and underneath both of those things, a quality that had no word in standard but that he recognized immediately as something he had only ever seen in people who understood their own weight in the world. Not arrogance, something older than arrogance, rootedness. The opening sequence took perhaps 4 minutes. He did not write during it. He would write afterward. He would remember it clearly, and the writing would be better for having been deferred. He watched the way her breath set the rhythm before her body did the exhale that preceded each movement, so that the movement emerged from breath rather than commanding it. He watched the particular quality of attention she kept for the space around her while doing something that required full internal focus. He watched her be completely in 2 places at once, inside the sequence and tracking the room, and understood that this was not a skill. This was a way of existing, something she had practiced until it was structural. When she finished, she turned to him with the slight shift of someone coming back into ordinary time from somewhere more concentrated. "Well," she said. "I'm going to need you to do it again," he said, "slower, and I'm going to need you to tell me what each part means while you're doing it." She looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since he had come aboard, she smiled. Not widely, not in the way that movies about alien first contact always showed, which was a kind of universal joy that proved everyone was the same underneath. It was a specific smile, the smile of someone who has just received confirmation of something they suspected but were not sure of. He wrote for a long time after that. He wrote until his hand ached. He wrote in the kind of focused silence that only happens when the material is larger than the writer's current capacity to hold it, and the only solution is to keep writing faster. Vera did not interrupt him. She sat at the far side of the chamber and watched her people and let him write, and he noticed, in the peripheral awareness of someone trained to notice things, that she looked at him the same way she looked at them, with the particular attention of someone tracking something they find unexpectedly worth tracking. On the third day, everything changed. He woke at ship cycle 600 to find Serafina Voss standing at the door of his quarters with a face the color of old paper. She had a tablet in her hand. She held it out without speaking. It was a message from the Colonial Navy High Command, classified. Above his clearance level, he shouldn't have been able to see it, which meant Serafina had broken a fair number of regulations to obtain it, and was now looking at him with the face of someone who has broken regulations and is not entirely sure they should have. The message was short. It described the corridor as a tactical opportunity. It described the invitation as likely a data-gathering exercise by Moonfang intelligence. It authorized a strike package, 3 destroyers, now positioned at the corridor's entry point, awaiting a signal that the diplomatic liaison would provide if she confirmed that the Moonfang ship was, as suspected, a command vessel with the Heiress aboard. Serafina had confirmed it. She had sent the confirmation 8 hours ago before she'd read this response. She had followed protocol. Protocol had produced this. Callum stood very still for a moment, holding the tablet, reading the message a second time and then a third, with the particular stillness of someone running fast internal calculations. "When does the strike package move?" he said. 14 hours, unless we send a stand down, she looked at him, or unless we lose communication. "That's an idea," he said. "It's also a court-martial offense." "Yes," he handed the tablet back to her. "I need an hour." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way people read faces when they've already decided to trust someone and are looking for confirmation. Then she nodded and went back to her quarters, and he went to find Vera. He found her in the cartography room, alone, updating the star maps with something that required her full attention, and a stylus that she held with the precise grip of someone who had been doing this specific task for years. She heard him come in. The Moonfang senses were considerably sharper than human standard, a fact the military files had mentioned without ever considering what it might mean to have been heard in situations where you were trying to be quiet, to have been smelled in situations where you thought you were hidden, and she turned to look at him without haste. "You look like something has happened," she said, not a question. "Something has happened," he confirmed. He told her all of it. The message, the strike package, the timing, Serafina's confirmation, his own presence on the ship under false pretenses. Not the journalist's false pretenses. Those had been real. But the false pretense that the Colonial Press Bureau was acting independently of the military, when in fact his editor's clearance for this assignment had come from a military liaison whose name he had not been given. He told her without softening it. He had learned, over 11 years of writing about war, that there was no version of a hard truth that was easier to receive for being delivered carefully. You could shape the delivery and you could control the order of information, and you could time it correctly, but the truth itself arrived as itself regardless of the wrapping. So he gave it to her plain. What he knew, when he had learned it, how long he had been sitting on it since Serafina had walked to his door, and what he thought they could do about it in the time they had. He told her because not telling her was the thing that would get her killed, and he had spent 11 years writing the truth about a war, and he was done being the last person in the room to use it as a weapon. Vera listened without moving. She did not interrupt. When he stopped speaking, she set her stylus down on the map table with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, and she turned to face him fully. What he had expected, rage, or the cold command effect the military files described, or the particular kind of betrayal face that happens when someone has made a leap of trust and discovered that the ground where they landed was not what they had been told it was. What he got was none of those things, which was far harder to face. It was the look of someone who has already spent 11 years being told they are wrong about what is happening to them and has just received the latest in a long series of confirmations. Not surprise, Not even anger exactly. Something far older and more expensive than anger. The look of a person who has been right and who takes no satisfaction in it. You knew, he said, because the look was not the look of someone who had been shocked. I did not know, she said carefully. I suspected. I have suspected for 3 years that any diplomatic opening would be used as a targeting opportunity. I have run this specific calculation, a journalist, a corridor, a ship with the heiress aboard, and I assessed the probability at 62% that it was a targeting mechanism. She looked at the map table. A pause. I proceeded anyway because the alternative was to proceed never. He absorbed that. You knew there was a 60% chance this was a trap, and you opened the corridor anyway. 62, she said. And yes, she looked at him directly. Because the 38% chance it was not a trap contained everything I have spent 9 years building the archive for. Because 31,408 dead people deserve for someone to take a 62% risk on the truth. Her voice did not rise. It had no need to rise. It was already doing everything a voice needed to do. Because if I waited for a safe moment to expose the compact, I would wait until the war had consumed everything I was trying to protect. The silence was specific and complete. I did not know, she said again more quietly, that they would send someone. She stopped. She looked at her map table. Someone I found it useful to trust, she finished, which was, Callum was beginning to understand, not exactly what she had been going to say. How many people on this ship? He said. 412. He nodded. I'm going to lose my press credentials, he said. My editor is going to find out I deliberately disabled the communication relay, and she's going to remove my credentials and possibly have me arrested, and she will absolutely be right to do both of those things. Vera looked at him. You are going to disable the communication relay. I'm going to disable the communication relay, he confirmed. And while I'm doing that, I need you to start your engines, because 14 hours is a much narrower window than it sounds. She looked at him for a long moment. The amber eyes, the vertical pupils, the extraordinary density of the scarification along her jaw and temple that he had learned over 2 days to read as lineage and loss and survival and stubbornness, and the particular quality of courage that belongs to people who have been afraid for a long time and have not stopped moving. She looked at him the way she had looked at her warriors in the training ground, with that full attention, that tracking interest, and then she said, "Why?" He thought about how to answer that. He was a man who worked in words, and he was aware of how badly they could fail. I came here to write a story about who you are, he said finally. I wrote the Kepler Station Dispatch. I wrote it because I was there and I saw what happened and I wrote what was true. That's the only thing I know how to do. A pause. I'm not going to let 412 people die because some admiral who has never been in the same room as a Moonfang warrior decided this corridor was a tactical opportunity. The silence between them lasted approximately 3 seconds, which is a very long time. The relay is in Junction 7, she said. I will have someone show you, and then I will start the engines. He smiled a small, exhausted, completely genuine smile. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said, and there was something in her voice that was very close to warmth, though it came through several filters of self-possession that he suspected she was not entirely aware of. I am still deciding what to do with you when this is over. He disabled the relay at Junction 7 with a wrench he borrowed from one of Vera's engineers, who watched him do it with an expression of elaborate neutrality, and then handed him a second wrench because the second coupling was harder to reach. The ship began to move while he was still in the junction, and the deep vibration of the Moonfang drive system ran through the hull and into his hands and up his arms in a way that felt, improbably, like the ship's breathing had changed, deepened, steadied, committed. They ran for 7 hours. The 3 destroyers at the corridor entrance received no confirmation signal, and after a mandatory 4-hour hold, a stand-down signal from the liaison, who had by then had sufficient time to think carefully about what she was doing, and had decided to do the same thing Callum had decided to do, though from a different angle and with considerably more institutional peril. Serafina Voss would later lose her diplomatic commission and her pension. She would not, he noted, be sorry. The Moonfang ship exited the corridor at a point that was not on any colonial navy chart and disappeared into the dense stellar territory beyond, which the Navy did not have the navigation models to follow. In the cartography room, alone with the breathing walls and the star maps and the small stylus that she picked up again, and then set down again without doing anything with it, Vera stood for a long time. He found her there. He was not sure why he went to find her specifically. He had a notebook full of material that was going to change the course of the war if he could get it published, and his editor was going to be extremely angry with him, and he was going to need to find a way to transmit 11 years' worth of documentation about the Meridian Compact from a location that was not on any chart. He had considerable practical problems to occupy him. He went to find her anyway. "I owe you 2 days of context," he said from the doorway. She turned. She was not startled. She had heard him coming, of course. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You acted as a person of integrity when you had the option to act otherwise. That is not a debt. It is a baseline." "The story," he said. "The documentation. The compact. If I can get this out, if the Colonial Press Bureau runs it, or if I have to go to an independent outlet, or if I have to hand it to every member of the Assembly one at a time in person, it changes things. Not overnight, but it changes things." "I know," she said. "I'll need your help transmitting the documentation." "I know that too." She looked at the map table. "I will provide everything we have. It is substantial." A small pause. "We have been building this archive for 9 years in the event that someone was willing to use it." He came into the room properly. The bioluminescent growth on the walls shifted slightly as he moved, tracking warmth the way plants track light, and he had stopped being unsettled by that and started finding it beautiful somewhere around hour 14. "You said there were other reasons," he said, "for inviting a journalist specifically. You said that was one of them, the truth. What were the others?" She looked at him for a longer moment than was strictly necessary. "You wrote," she said, "the station did not fall. It was peeled open like something that was supposed to be hollow inside and wasn't. I found that accurate because I was there, and I watched that station resist for 72 hours under conditions that no military planner would have projected as survivable. And I wanted to understand how a species produces people like that. People who hold when they should break." A pause. "Your dispatches were the only material I found that attempted to answer that question honestly." He was quiet for a moment. The ship breathed around them. "We're stubborn," he said. "It's mostly that." Her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but a near relative of one. "I have found that to be true," she said, "in a specific and remarkable way." She looked at the maps. "My people have a word. There is no standard equivalent. It describes the quality of continuing to move through something that is supposed to stop you. The warriors practice it in the training sequences. It is not bravery exactly. Bravery is the absence of fear. This is a continuing in the presence of fear. We consider it the highest quality." "We have a word for that too," he said. "But it's not a single word, it's a story. It's always a story." "Yes," she said, "I know. I have been reading your stories for 11 years. The transmission package took 4 days to prepare. He worked with 2 of Vera's archivists, Keth, who was young and meticulous and had a perfectionist's horror of any ambiguous citation, and an older archivist named Priya whose standard was more fluent than Callum's own, and who had the habit of standing very close to the work's surface and reading with her entire body, inclined forward, as if the documents required physical proximity to yield their full meaning. The pairing produced a communication style requiring significant patience on all sides. Keth wanted everything sourced to primary documents. Callum wanted the narrative connective tissue between the source documents to be readable by someone who had not spent 9 years building an archive. Priya wanted the standard to be precise enough that no human editor could claim ambiguity as a reason not to run it. They argued, in the constructive way of people who are all trying to produce the same thing and have different ideas of what constitutes sufficient, and the arguments produced a better document than any of them would have made alone. Vera reviewed every page before transmission. She made precise corrections where the documentation intersected with events she had witnessed personally. Not many corrections, because the archive was extraordinarily accurate. And besides some of her corrections, she wrote notes in standard that were not strictly necessary for accuracy, but that he found himself reading more than once anyway, in the quiet of his quarters after the archivists had retired. One of them read, "At Kepler Station, the commander of the station's final defensive unit had been dead for 6 hours. His unit did not know this. They held for another 9 hours under a chain of command that did not exist. I have thought about this for 2 years." He sat with that for a while. He had been there. He had written about that unit, not knowing at the time that the chain of command had not existed. He had written about their stubbornness, their refusal to break. He had attributed it to training, to esprit de corps, to the specific quality of the human soldiers he had spent 11 years embedding with and had come to understand were capable of things that defied projection. He had not known that what he was actually watching was a group of people carrying their dead commander forward through the thing that was supposed to stop them, because no one had told them they were allowed to stop. He added Vera's note to the annotation file. Then he sat for a long time, thinking about that unit, and about the Vareth Narrows Memorial, and about 31,408 dead Moonfang counted with the rigorous methodology of a people who did not allow their grief to round numbers up or down, and he understood that the transmission was not just documentation. It was the names of the dead, finally aligned against the thing that had actually killed them. On the 4th day, she found him at the small desk in his quarters with his notebook open and his pen not moving, which was unusual enough that she paused in the doorway. "You are not writing," she said. "I'm thinking about the transmission, about the piece I'm going to write after the transmission." He looked at the notebook. "I've been writing about war for 11 years. I'm going to write something different." "What?" He looked up. "I'm going to write about what your people do in that training chamber. I'm going to write it for an audience that has never seen it and doesn't have any context for it and will have to be led through it carefully, piece by piece, until they understand what they're looking at." A pause. "It's going to be the hardest thing I've ever written." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Would it be useful to observe it again?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It would be very useful." They went together to the training chamber on the lower deck, and this time she stood closer, not guiding exactly, but available, and when a sequence began that she recognized, she would say its name quietly in her own language and then its meaning in standard, and he would write it down in the notebook that was now almost full. The warriors moved through the patterns around them without breaking. They were accustomed to the heiress observing, and apparently accustomed now to the human who wrote things down. "This sequence," she said, as 2 warriors moved through something that looked from a distance like an argument and from close range looked like a conversation. "It records the concordance of 12 clans, the first treaty, 300 years before we encountered any other spacefaring species. What happened in the treaty? 2 clans had been at war for 60 years. A third clan, smaller, acted as mediator. The mediator said, 'The war between you has made you identical. You have become your enemy's mirror. Lay down your mirrors.'" She watched the 2 warriors. "It is still our primary diplomatic formula. Lay down your mirrors. We say it at the start of every negotiation. You should have said it to us 11 years ago." "We did," she said quietly. "We said it 11 years ago at the first engagement. The response was weapons fire. She did not say this with bitterness. She said it the way she had reviewed the compact documents, with precision, with documentation, with the understanding that the factual account of a thing is more damning than any emotional rendering of it. He wrote, "Lay down your mirrors." He wrote it 3 times, the way you write something when you know it's going to be the center of everything else. The transmission went out on the 5th day. It went through 11 relay stations, the same 11 that the Moonfang's original invitation had used, which Vera had identified as outside the Meridian Compact's monitoring network, a detail she had clearly thought through long before this week. The packet was 314 pages of documentation, time-stamped across 9 years, with source annotations in both Standard and Moonfang script, cross-referenced against colonial Navy engagement records that the Navy's own historians had never managed to reconcile and had eventually stopped trying to. It reached the Colonial Press Bureau in 17 hours. It reached every member of the Assembly in 22 hours, because Serafina Voss, from whatever undisclosed location she had retreated to after her dismissal, had sent it to them simultaneously with a cover letter that was, by all later accounts, among the more devastating pieces of institutional prose produced in the 11-year period. He was on the bridge, an invitation he had not expected, extended quietly by one of Vera's commanders the morning the transmission was cued, when the confirmation signal came back from the first relay station. The bridge was nothing like the colonial Navy bridges he had spent years on. It was quieter. It smelled of the bioluminescent growth that lined the walls and of something mineral and cold that was the ship's own chemistry. The Moonfang crew moved in the same patterns he had seen in the training chamber, not synchronized, but resonant, their coordination emerging from the same physical language that the sequences encoded. They did not watch him. They had accepted his presence in the way that people accept something when someone they trust has indicated it is acceptable, without the deliberate performance of acceptance. He stood near the back of the bridge and watched the confirmation signals arrive, one by one, from each relay station, small lights on a board that Vera read with the same attention she gave the star maps, and he thought about Patricia Cho's face when she saw the package, and whether she would be angry first or stunned first, and whether either of those things would stop her from running it. He was fairly sure nothing would stop Patricia from running it. She had sent him into a corridor with a diplomatic liaison and minimal protection to get a story. She would run the story. The Meridian Compact's response was to deny everything. This was expected. The documentation did not require their cooperation. The documentation was the kind of specific, time-stamped, multiply-sourced material that does not require anyone to admit anything, because it does the admitting itself. The routing records and the broker payments and the doctored intelligence assessments and the communications between compact officials, written in the matter-of-fact tone of people who have never once considered that anyone would find their records, discussing 31,408 dead Moonfang and 900 dead at Vareth Narrows and 1,700 words sent from Proxima Base, as line items in a resource extraction operation. 3 assembly members with financial connections to compact-adjacent trading networks resigned within 72 hours. The Colonial Navy High Command ordered an immediate review of all engagement authorizations from the previous 11 years. The 3 destroyers at the corridor entrance were recalled. The war did not end that day. It ended in stages, the way most things end, reluctantly, unevenly, with considerable argument about who was responsible for what and considerable maneuvering by people who had profited from the arrangement and were not enthusiastic about accounting for it. But it moved. It unmistakably, irrevocably moved. Callum transmitted his piece about the training chamber 3 days after the documentation package. It ran under the headline that Patricia Cho chose, which was not the headline he had written, but which he conceded was better. The original title he had filed was, A language they don't teach. Patricia's title was, No One Falls Alone, Inside the Moonfang Training Chambers Where History Lives in the Body. It ran at 7,000 words and was read, in the week following its publication, by more people than any dispatch he had ever filed. More, by a significant margin, than the Kepler station piece that had established his career. He would later attribute this to the fact that people were hungry for a story that was not about destruction. That had always been about destruction, the whole weight of 11 years of nothing but destruction. And the piece about the training chamber was a story about something that had survived destruction, and then turned around and asked if you wanted to learn how. In the cartography room of the Moonfang ship, on the day the transmission went out, Vera stood at her map table and updated the star charts with the stylus she held in the precise grip of long practice, and then she set it down and looked at the maps for a long time. One of her commanders, the oldest of the four, a warrior named Gaz who had the most extraordinary scarification Callum had ever seen on any face of any species, a record of 60 years of battles and survivals carved into skin the color of deep water, came to stand at her shoulder and looked at the maps with her. "It moves," he said. "It moves," she agreed. "Your father would have," he stopped. "My father was not wrong," she said. "He had incomplete information, that is different." She picked up the stylus again. "We will update the charts, the corridor is open. We should map it properly." In the anteroom outside, Callum sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his notebook balanced on his knee and wrote for 4 straight hours, and the ship breathed around him, and the bioluminescent growth on the walls shifted toward him slowly the way plants shift toward warmth, and he let it. She found him there at the end of the 4 hours, in the way that people find each other on ships when the ship is not very large and both people know it. "The transmission has reached the assembly," she said. "I know, I got confirmation 20 minutes ago." She looked at the notebook. He had filled it completely. "You are out of pages." He looked down at the last filled page. "I am," he agreed. He had always hated this moment in the old days, the transition between notebooks, the gap before the new one opened. Now it felt different. It felt like a natural stopping point, a period. She sat down, not far from him, with the ease of someone who has decided to stop calculating the distance. The ship's sounds moved around them, biological and constant. "When this is over," she said, "and you return to your people, what will you tell them? Beyond the dispatches, beyond the documentation, if someone asked you what you found here in one answer." He thought about it for a long time. He owed her that, the patience to think rather than perform. He had interviewed hundreds of people in 11 years. He had asked hard questions and waited out long silences, and never filled the silences with his own voice, because he understood that his voice was not what was needed. Now, he did the same thing in reverse. He sat with her question until the shape of an answer began to form. "I'd tell them what you said," he said finally. "The training sequence, what it means." He looked at her. "No one falls alone. And then I'd tell them that there's a people in the Reach who have been saying that for 300 years in a language we never bothered to learn, and that if we'd learned it 11 years ago, a lot of people would still be alive." She was quiet for a moment. The amber eyes, the vertical pupils, all the scarification that he had spent 5 days learning to read, the lineage marks along her temple, the battle record along her jaw, the small marks near her left eye that he had learned on day 4 from one of her archivists were placed in grief, not in triumph, for the Moonfang dead at engagements that she as heiress had been required to authorize. He could read more of it now than he could on the first day. Not all of it. Probably not all of it ever. But more than he could read on the day she walked through that hatch like she owned the physics of the room, and he was aware that more was better than none, and that none had been the starting position of the entire 11-year war. "What will you tell your people?" he asked. "About this?" She considered it with the same unhurried patience she had brought to everything. I will tell them that humans are more complex than our files suggested, she said. I will tell them that the species which held Kepler Station for 72 hours under conditions that should have ended them in 6 is also the species that sent a man with a notebook into a corridor that carried a 62% probability of being a targeting mechanism, because telling the truth was more important than the risk. A pause. I will tell them these are probably not unrelated facts. He looked at her, the ship breathed around them. The bioluminescent growth on the walls had shifted closer over the last hour, drawn by warmth or sound or some quality of the air between two people sitting in concentrated proximity. And the light it cast was low and specific, and made the room feel smaller than it was, in a way that was not unpleasant. My people have a question, she said. We ask it of people who have acted with unusual integrity in difficult circumstances. We ask it before we consider any long-term arrangement. She looked at him directly. Are you willing to continue? He looked back at her. Continue what? Whatever this is, she said, with the precision of someone who means exactly what they say and has chosen each word deliberately, and has, in the choosing, excluded certain words that might have been more accurate but were also considerably more exposed. The documentation, the stories, the translation in both directions, the work of making two peoples comprehensible to each other, which is not finished and will not be finished quickly and will require, I think, a great deal of what your people call stubbornness. The ship breathed. The walls shifted. Outside the hull, in the dense stellar field of the Reach, the stars moved in their ancient patterns through space that no colonial chart had ever mapped. I'm a journalist, he said. I write things down until people understand them. That's the whole job. A pause. Yes. She nodded. The small, contained nod of someone who has received the answer they were hoping for but was too disciplined to expect. And then she reached into the fold of her coat and produced a notebook, small, dark-covered, made of a material he didn't recognize, but that had the specific heft of something that had been made to last, and she held it out. We keep records too, she said. You are out of pages. He took the notebook. He opened it. The pages were blank, slightly different from any material he'd ever written on, with a quality that suggested they would hold ink well. The cover was warm, not from her hand. It had a warmth that was its own, some quality of the material. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said, exactly as she had said before in the cartography room when this had all still been uncertain. But this time the filters in her voice were arranged differently, and what came through them was correspondingly different. Thank me by filling it. He uncapped his pen. Outside the hull, the stars of the Reach burned in configurations that were not on any colonial chart, and that were, the Moonfang had spent 3,000 years learning, extraordinarily beautiful if you took the time to learn their names. The ship moved through them with the deliberate ease of something that belonged there, the deep throb of its drive system, the biological rhythms of the living hull, the low resonant sounds of 48 warriors on the lower deck moving through a sequence that was older than the war and would outlast the war, and would carry the war in its body the way all their history was carried, not in books or databases, but in muscle and breath and the trust of one person falling into the steady arms of another. He started at the top of the first page. He wrote, "The war ended the way most things end, not in a single moment but in layers like ice breaking up in spring, each layer releasing the one below it, until the water was moving again and you could look at the river and understand that it had always been a river, that the ice had been temporary, that the moving was the truth of the thing." He wrote, "There is a people in the Reach who have been saying this for 300 years. Lay down your mirrors." He wrote, "I am learning their language. It will take a long time. I have a new notebook and a lot of pages." He wrote for a long time. The ship moved through the dense stars of the Reach, through territory that no colonial navigation AI had ever mapped, guided by people who had learned the names of every star in it and passed those names down through their bodies for 3,000 years, and it breathed, and Callum Reyes wrote in the dark of a new notebook. And beside him the Moonfang Heiress was quiet and watchful and present. And outside the hole the stars were, as it turned out, extraordinarily beautiful.